The smell of turpentine and expensive Bordeaux clashed in the suffocating silence of the Caldwell dining room as Marissa's father raised his glass to a toast that felt more like a death sentence. Under the heavy oak table, her knuckles were stained a defiant azure. But her hand trembled so violently, she had to white-knuckle her linen napkin to keep from screaming. Across the table, her fiancé Julian didn't look at her with love. He watched her with the cold, calculating hunger of a man checking the teeth of a prize horse he'd just bought to settle a debt. The tension snapped when her brother James leaned in, his voice a low, jagged whisper that only she could hear. "I found your secret, Marissa. By morning, it'll be ash." He didn't wait for her reaction before the sound of a heavy bolt sliding into place echoed from the hallway, locking her inside a world of polished silver and velvet-lined cages. As Julian reached across the lace tablecloth to squeeze her wrist, his grip tight enough to bruise, Marissa realized the wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a hostile takeover, and she was the only one who knew the catastrophic price of the contract. The tip of Marissa Caldwell's fine brush hovered a fraction of a millimeter from the canvas, suspended in a moment of agonizing precision. She held her breath, the air in the room thick with the scent of linseed oil and the sharp, medicinal tang of turpentine. With a microscopic movement, she applied the final stroke of ochre to the depiction of a dying sun. The orange hue bled into the surrounding purples, completing the horizon. Marissa exhaled, a ragged sound in the oppressive silence of her bedroom. She pulled away, squinting against the harsh, yellow glare of her desk lamp, and began to rub her cramped fingers. Azure stains clung to her knuckles like bruises. She scrutinized the portfolio, tracing the fluidity of the transitions and the surgical sharpness of the lines. This was her ticket out, her secret language. Suddenly, the heavy thud of footsteps vibrated through the floorboards outside. Marissa lunged forward, grabbing a thick cloth and throwing it over the easel. She stood frozen, heart hammering against her ribs, listening as the echo of the intruder retreated down the hallway. The silence returned, but it offered no comfort. Marissa sank to her knees before the towering Victorian wardrobe that dominated the corner of her room. Her fingers searched the dark grain of the wood until they found the nearly invisible seam in the back panel. The mahogany felt like ice against her skin as she pried it open. With practiced tenderness, she slid the bulging folder containing her life's work into the narrow cavity between the furniture and the plaster wall. Every second felt measured by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer, a countdown to the noon deadline tomorrow. Images of the Academy's curator flashed through her mind, stern faces, white-walled galleries, a world where her name meant something other than a bargaining chip. She meticulously rearranged her stacks of linen over the hidden compartment, masking the entrance to her sanctuary. Wiping her damp palms against her silk skirt, she tried to steady her trembling knees, bracing for the leap she intended to take. Dinner was served with the usual suffocating solemnity. Thomas Caldwell dropped his silver fork onto the fine china plate with a dry clatter that made Marissa flinch. The rich aroma of roasted duck mingled with the heavy, fermented scent of an expensive Bordeaux, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a courtroom than a dining room. Thomas straightened his spine, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the table as he surveyed his family with a predatory gaze. He spoke of legacy, of the endurance of the Caldwell name, and the necessity of fortification. Raising his crystal glass, he caught the light of the chandelier, his eyes gleaming with a cold, calculated triumph. He officially announced the betrothal of Marissa to Julian Harris, framing it as a glorious union of two great dynasties. Marissa felt a glacial chill sweep through her veins. The walls of the dining room seemed to contract, squeezing the oxygen from her lungs. Across the table, Julian gave Thomas a sharp, knowing nod. A predatory smile playing on his thin lips, while Marissa's fingers white-knuckled the linen napkin beneath the table. The silence that followed the announcement was heavy, expectant. Marissa opened her mouth to speak, to hurl her refusal into the center of the table. But her voice emerged as a pathetic, gravelly rasp. Thomas didn't wait for her to find her strength. He slammed his palm against the oak table, a violent crack that sent the wine sloshing against the sides of the glasses. Marissa watched his nostrils flare, the skin around his eyes tightening with a frigid rage that brooked no dissent. He began to speak of duty, of the sacred nature of family honor, his words cutting through any possibility of her mentioning her own dreams or the academy. He spoke as if she were a piece of real estate being rezoned for a more profitable use. Marissa sank into the high back of her chair, the physical weight of her father's authority pressing down on her like a slab of granite. She fell silent, her gaze dropping to her pale, useless hands, while Thomas continued to map out the geography of her captive future. James Caldwell leaned against the mahogany doorframe of the hallway. His eyes narrowed as he watched Marissa hurry past him. He noted the frantic glitter in her eyes, the way she clutched at her skirts as if she were hiding a wound. A smudge of lapis lazuli paint remained on the knuckle of her index finger, a vibrant stain that didn't belong in this house of muted tones. As she disappeared into her bedroom and the lock clicked, James pushed off the wall. He followed her with the silent, practiced grace of a hunter, his leather soles making no sound on the polished floor. He tucked himself into the shadows of a recessed niche near her door, recording every sharp movement he could hear from within. The sliding of furniture, the hurried rustle of paper, her frequent, panicked glances toward the hallway. James could smell the change in her, a scent of rebellion that offended his sense of order. He decided then that he would unearth whatever secret she was trying to bury away from Thomas's sight. Later that evening, the house felt like a tomb. Marissa moved through the shadows of the library, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. She froze when the low, resonant voice of Thomas Caldwell drifted from the half-open door of the study. He was speaking with Julian. They weren't discussing love or companionship. They were debating payment schedules and the transfer of controlling interest in the textile mills. Julian's voice was dry, clinical, as he listed Marissa as the primary collateral for the successful completion of the merger. Marissa pressed her palm against her mouth to stifle a cry. She heard Julian recite the clauses of the prenuptial agreement like a grocery list. There was no fatherly warmth in Thomas's tone, only the cold, hard math of a man trying to save his sinking ship from the icy waters of bankruptcy. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was a currency, and Julian was buying her silence along with the Caldwell assets. The next morning, the fragile peace of her room was shattered. The bedroom door flew open with a violent kick that sent the wood screaming against the hinges. James burst in, his chest heaving with a dark, suppressed energy. He didn't say a word as he lunged for the wardrobe, ripping the masking linens away with a savage hand. He found the seam, his fingers tearing at the wood, until he hauled the portfolio from its hiding place. Sketches and watercolors spilled across the rug like autumn leaves. Marissa threw herself forward, a desperate cry dying in her throat. But James shoved her back with a brutal shove. He grabbed the first painting, a vivid depiction of the Delaware Bay at dawn, and with a sickening, rhythmic tear, he shredded the canvas in half. He stared directly into her tear-filled eyes as he worked. One by one, her hopes were reduced to confetti under his merciless fingers. Marissa collapsed to her knees amidst the wreckage, watching James stomp the remnants of her world into the pile of the carpet. James turned to leave, his face a mask of cold contempt as he looked down at his sobbing sister. He stepped over a ruined portrait and exited, slamming the heavy oak door with a finality that shook the walls. Marissa heard the sharp, metallic snap of the key, turning in the lock, followed by the heavy slide of the exterior bolt. She scrambled to the door, her fingers clawing at the wood, wrenching the brass handle until her palms bled. But it remained a solid, unmoving wall. Outside, the sound of James's retreating footsteps faded into the distance, taking with them any hope of reaching the academy by noon. She beat her fists against the grain of the door, her screams of frustration echoing back at her from the empty corners of her room. The silence of the corridor eventually returned, absolute and suffocating, a silent witness to her internment. Marissa slumped against the base of the door, surrounded by the jagged remains of her art. She stared at the slivers of gray light filtering through the locked slats of the window blinds. Every familiar object in the room, the vanity, the lace curtains, the porcelain wash basin, now appeared as a constituent part of an elaborate cage designed by Thomas and James. She realized with a sickening clarity that the men she called family had transitioned into wardens, men who would gladly pulverize her soul if it meant the ledger stayed in the black. The betrayal pulsed in her chest, a physical wound that throbbed in time with her heartbeat. She wasn't a daughter or sister anymore. She was a trophy, a valuable piece of livestock being kept in a high tower until the buyer arrived to claim his prize. The following morning, Thomas entered the room. His face was a carved mask of New England granite, devoid of any trace of the man who had once held her on his shoulders. He didn't look her in the eye. Instead, he tossed a thick, leather-bound wedding contract onto the unmade bed, pointing a blunt finger at the empty signature line. His voice was a flat, emotionless drone as he delivered the ultimatum. She would marry Julian, or she would be cast out of the house that very hour without a single cent to her name or a coat on her back. Marissa saw her trunk sitting in the doorway, already packed by the servants under her father's direction. A silent, leather-clad threat. The choice Thomas presented was a desert. There was no shade, no water, and no way to turn back. Later, Marissa sat across from Julian in the cavernous, empty drawing room. The air between them felt charged, heavy with his scrutiny. Julian reached out and took her hand, his grip tightening until the bones in her fingers ground together. It was a demonstration of ownership, a silent command for her to acknowledge his strength. He spoke of their future home in Chestnut Hill, but his description sounded like the operating manual for a maximum security facility. Every time she shifted or tried to pull away, his eyes darkened with an irritable flash, a warning that her autonomy was a thing of the past. The danger radiating from him was palpable, a static charge in the air that signaled the coming of a devastating storm. Marissa lowered her gaze, her long lashes casting shadows over her pale cheeks. "I understand," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. Thomas, standing by the fireplace, let out a breath he seemed to have been holding, his lips curling into a smile of predatory victory. Inside Marissa, the despair didn't vanish. It simply crystallized into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. She looked up and offered Julian a fragile, fraudulent smile, accepting his cold congratulations with the grace of a professional mourner. She began to discuss the logistics of the ceremony, her voice soft and compliant. She watched James's shoulders relax as he leaned against the sideboard, his suspicion waning. They thought they had broken her. They didn't realize they had simply forced her to become as deceptive as they were. The surveillance began within 48 hours of her feigned surrender. Julian stood in the center of Marissa's bedroom, the whine of a high-speed drill echoing off the walls as he bored into the delicate plaster of the ceiling. White dust drifted down like snow, settling on his charcoal gray suit jacket. He carefully mounted a tiny, glass-eyed lens within the ornate molding directly above her bed. When he finished, he climbed down from the stepladder and turned toward her. Without a word, he snatched her smartphone from her hand. In its place, he pressed a heavy, matte black device into her palm. A red light blinked at the top of the screen, the active heartbeat of a GPS tracker. Marissa felt a wave of nausea as he entered a sequence of codes, activating a suite of software that would allow him to monitor her every digital footprint and physical movement from his own device. 2 days later, the walls of the house felt like they were closing in. Marissa pushed against the heavy glass door leading to the terrace, desperate for the scent of rain-drenched earth and the sight of the rose bushes. Her path was abruptly blocked by a wall of dark wool. A man in a tailored suit, his shoulders broad enough to fill the entire frame, stood on the stone steps. He didn't move, his arms crossed over a chest that looked as solid as a safe. The afternoon sun glinted off his opaque aviator glasses, hiding his eyes but reflecting Marissa's own pale, trapped expression. He tapped a leather-bound tablet, wordlessly demanding her digital authorization or a physical pass signed by Julian. Marissa backed away, the automatic lock on the door clicking into place with a sound like a guillotine. The garden, with all its light and space, became a taunting mirage. The psychological siege continued in the dressing room. Marissa stood atop a circular velvet pedestal, her body draped in yards of heavy, suffocating ivory satin. Julian paced around her, his fingers twitching as he inspected the work of the seamstresses. He reached out and yanked the fabric upward, pinning the neckline so high it chafed her throat. The lead dressmaker stood by, her pins trembling in her hand, as Julian ordered the sleeves to be lengthened until they obscured her knuckles. He demanded an extra layer of heavy crinoline and a thicker lining beneath the lace, transforming the gown into a stiff, opaque sarcophagus that hid even the curve of her neck. Marissa stared into the three-way mirror, seeing a stranger, a doll dressed in a shroud of white, stripped of even the smallest right to her own skin. Night offered the only opportunity for movement. Marissa moved through the dark library, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. She navigated by the pale, silvery glow of a Philadelphia moon, filtering through the high windows. Her fingers traced the edges of the heavy gold frame of her grandfather's portrait until they found the hidden latch. The safe door swung open with a muffled click. She pulled out a stack of ledgers and folders that smelled of old ink and stagnant air. A small penlight illuminated the pages, revealing a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts under Julian's name. She saw red ink everywhere, notices of default, frantic transfers of funds, and a series of fraudulent invoices. Her breath hitched. This wasn't a business. It was a crumbling house of cards. Julian wasn't just a tyrant. He was a desperate man drowning in a sea of his own making. She spread the documents on the floor, her mind racing as she cross-referenced the dates of the transactions with the schedule of her own dowry payments. Every cent Thomas had already transferred to Harris and Associates had been immediately diverted to cover interest payments on massive, high-interest loans. Julian was using the Caldwell fortune as a temporary bandage for a hemorrhaging empire. The numbers on the page told a story of a man who didn't want a wife. He wanted a life raft. He was cannibalizing her family's remaining wealth to stave off a prison sentence for wire fraud. Marissa gripped the edges of a bank statement, the paper crinkling under her fingers. She realized with a jolt of terror that if this marriage went through, she wouldn't just be a prisoner. She would be the fall girl for a bankrupt criminal. Desperation drove her to seek an ally. She intercepted James in the dim, amber light of the upstairs hallway, thrusting a photocopied bank statement toward him. James didn't even slow down. He brushed her hand aside with a lazy, dismissive flick of his wrist, his eyes never even touching the damning columns of figures. Marissa grabbed his sleeve, her voice a frantic whisper as she tried to explain the discrepancy in the asset valuations Julian had provided. James let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed uncomfortably off the high ceilings. He called her suspicions a hysterical fantasy, a pathetic ploy to avoid her marital obligations. He reached out and tucked a stray hair behind her ear with a touch that felt like a threat, then walked away, leaving her standing alone in the dark with the proof of their impending ruin. Minutes later, she burst into the library. Thomas was submerged in his leather armchair, a cloud of expensive Havana smoke swirling around his head. Marissa threw the stack of documents onto the mahogany desk, her finger trembling as she pointed to Julian's signature on a series of forged contracts. Thomas slowly looked up, his eyes reflecting nothing but a deep, weary irritation. She spoke of the empty accounts, the shell companies, and the fact that they were being bled dry by a con man. Thomas didn't even reach for the papers. He sat there, staring through her, his mind already committed to the lie. To acknowledge the truth would be to admit he had been fooled, and Thomas Caldwell would rather walk into a fire than admit a mistake. He stood up suddenly, the chair groaning under his weight. His broad hand slammed down on the documents, the force of the blow crumpling the thin paper. With a violent, twisting motion, he began to tear the reports into pieces. Marissa lunged to save a crucial bank draft, but he shoved her back, his face darkening to a dangerous shade of crimson. His voice boomed, accusing her of forgery and a vile, treacherous imagination. He called her a liar and an ingrate, a girl so desperate to chase her little hobby that she would ruin her father's reputation to do it. He threw the shredded remnants of her evidence into her face, the paper fluttering down like gray snow. He told her the deal with Julian was the only thing standing between them and the street, and he wouldn't let her delusions destroy it. The library doors swung open, hitting the stops with a heavy thud. Julian stood there, his eyes sweeping the room until they landed on the debris on the carpet. He didn't ask questions. He moved with the predatory speed of a man used to taking what he wanted. He grabbed Marissa by the shoulders, his fingers digging into her collarbones until she gasped. He shook her, his face inches from hers, his breath smelling of mint and cold iron. He demanded to know where she had gotten the files, his voice a low, vibrating growl. Thomas stood by, a silent, complicit witness, as Julian's grip tightened. Julian accused her of theft, of invading his privacy, his eyes burning with the realization that his prey had seen behind his mask. In the chaos of Julian's interrogation and Thomas's defensive shouting, Marissa spotted the last intact folder near the base of the armchair. She moved with a subtle, desperate grace, while Julian was distracted by a particularly sharp retort from Thomas. She slid her foot along the rug, nudging the leather binder deep into the shadows beneath the heavy velvet curtains. Julian jerked her around, his hand snaking down to crush her wrist. But he didn't see the evidence disappear into the darkness. Marissa's breath came in short, jagged bursts, her eyes locked on his as he began to drag her toward the door. The pain in her arm was a dull roar, but she managed one final glance at the curtain, a silent prayer that the truth would stay hidden until she could use it. Julian didn't take her back to her room. He shoved her into a small, windowless guest parlor on the ground floor. The room was a relic of the house's old servant wing, smelling of dust and cedar. The lock clicked with the finality of a prison bolt. Through the heavy wood, Marissa heard Julian bark a command to James. A moment later, a shadow blocked the thin line of light at the bottom of the door. James leaned against the frame on the other side, the metallic jingle of his keys a constant reminder of his presence. Marissa paced the small square of space, her hands grazing the fabric-covered walls. There were no windows, No secondary exits, only the stifling silence of a vault. James tapped his knuckles against the door, a rhythmic, mocking sound that told her he wouldn't be leaving his post until the guests arrived. Marissa sank onto the edge of a stiff, horsehair settee, her heart a frantic drum in the absolute darkness. From somewhere deep in the main house, she heard the first muffled notes of a piano and the distant, melodic chime of crystal. The guests were arriving. She could almost see them, the bankers, the politicians, the old money of Philadelphia, all coming to witness her sale. She imagined Julian and Thomas standing in the foyer, their smiles as bright and false as the diamonds they wore. Her mind raced, a frantic bird trapped in a box. She had the documents, but they were a floor away, and she was behind a locked door. She closed her eyes, trying to find a path through the labyrinth of their control, knowing that the next few hours would either be her end or her beginning. The door to the parlor creaked open just enough for a tray to be slid inside. A silent maid, her eyes averted, placed it on a low table. On the silver surface sat a tall glass of water, its surface shimmering with a slight, unnatural oiliness. A faint, bitter scent of sedatives drifted from the glass. Marissa picked it up, feeling the maid's lingering gaze from the doorway. She brought the rim to her lips, tilting her head back, but her throat remained closed. As the maid turned to adjust a lamp, Marissa lunged for a large potted fern in the corner. She tipped the glass, the drugged water vanishing into the dark, loamy soil. She set the empty glass back on the tray and collapsed onto the settee, her head lolling back, her breathing becoming slow and shallow. She heard the maid retreat and the lock click once more, leaving her in a feigned stupor. An hour later, James returned. He didn't bother to be quiet. He smelled of tobacco and the sharp, medicinal tang of gin. He grabbed her by the upper arm, hauling her upright with a force that made the seams of her gown groan. His fingers bit into her skin as he shook her, his face a mask of drunken irritation. "Wake up, princess," he hissed, his voice thick. He demanded she fix her face, telling her that the Caldwell name wouldn't be dragged through the mud by her pathetic, moping performance. He dragged her toward the door, his grip unyielding. Marissa allowed herself to be led, her head hanging low, her footsteps stumbling just enough to maintain the illusion of the drug's effects, while James adjusted her hair with a rough, proprietary hand. The hallway outside the library was a hive of activity. Servers moved in a frantic blur, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres and buckets of ice. In the swirling chaos of black coats and white aprons, James's attention wavered for a fraction of a second as he stepped aside for a large floral arrangement. Marissa didn't hesitate. She ducked behind a heavy mahogany pillar, her hand snaking into the velvet folds of the curtain where she had hidden the folder. Her fingers closed around the leather. With a frantic, silent prayer, she shoved the documents beneath the expansive, multi-layered silk of her skirt, pinning them against her waist with the stiff boning of her corset. The paper was sharp, biting into her ribs, but she didn't flinch. When James turned back, his face darkening with suspicion, she was already standing in the center of the hall, her eyes vacant and staring. Thomas was waiting at the base of the grand staircase, his tuxedo impeccable, his expression a wall of stone. As James delivered her, Thomas clamped his hand onto her elbow. His grip was a vice, the pressure so intense that her fingers began to tingle with a lack of circulation. He leaned down, his breath hot against her ear, smelling of peppermint and old bourbon. "One word, Marissa," he whispered, the threat vibrating in his chest. "One scene, and I will have you committed to the sanitarium in the Poconos before the sun rises. Do you understand?" He squeezed harder, a sharp reminder of his absolute power. Marissa nodded once, a mechanical movement, and leaned into him, using his arm as a crutch to hide the fact that she was trembling. The double doors to the banquet hall swung open, and the world became a deafening roar of strings and voices. The light from the massive crystal chandeliers was blinding, shattering into 1,000 needles of light against the jewelry of the gathered guests. Every head turned. Marissa felt the collective weight of their judgment, their eyes scanning her for any sign of the artistic temperament they whispered about behind her back. She felt like a specimen pinned to a board. Thomas led her through a corridor of false smiles and perfumed air, his hand never wavering from her arm. The scent of lilies was so thick it felt like a physical weight on her chest, making every breath a struggle in the overheated room. Julian broke away from a circle of men in black tie and approached them. He moved with a predatory confidence, his eyes locked on Marissa. He took her hand from Thomas, his lips lingering on her skin in a kiss that felt like a brand. His eyes, cold and sharp as obsidian, searched her face for any crack in her resolve. He didn't let go. Instead, he turned her hand over, his thumb pressing into the pulse point of her wrist. He felt the frantic, irregular beat of her heart, a small smile of satisfaction touching his lips. He interlaced his fingers with hers, the gesture appearing intimate to the room. But to Marissa, it was a handcuff. He began to lead her toward the center of the floor, his grip a silent promise of total possession. As they moved, a waiter passed with a tray of crystal flutes. The room began to quiet as the first toast was called. Marissa's gaze darted through the crowd, searching, until she found a man with a heavy, square jaw and a silver-flecked beard. Arthur Banks, the lead auditor for the bank that held the Caldwell's primary notes. He was standing near the edge of the dance floor, swirling a glass of neat scotch, his eyes fixed on Julian with a look of professional skepticism. The folder beneath her skirt felt like a lead weight, a ticking clock against her hip. She realized he was the only man in the room with the authority to stop the clock. She began to calculate the distance, her heart racing as she looked for a gap in the human wall surrounding her. Thomas stepped into the center of the room, raising a glass of champagne. His voice, trained in boardrooms and courtrooms, boomed through the hall, speaking of the unbreakable bond and the bright future of their combined interests. As he spoke, James moved into position directly behind Marissa, a silent sentinel in the shadows. She could smell the gin on his breath, feel the heat radiating from him. He placed a hand on the small of her back, his fingers grazing the very spot where the documents were hidden. Marissa stood perfectly still, her breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. Thomas continued his oration, his words a gilded cage being built around her in real time, while the guests nodded in rhythmic, mindless approval. Julian reached into his pocket and produced a small, black velvet box. He snapped it open, revealing a diamond the size of a knuckle, a cold, hard stone that caught the light with a cruel brilliance. He grabbed Marissa's wrist, wrenching her hand upward. The pressure was sudden and brutal, his fingers digging into the tendons of her forearm. She saw the skin beneath his grip turn a sickly white, then a bruised purple. He began to slide the ring onto her finger, his eyes locked on hers, a dark, triumphant glitter in his gaze. The pain in her arm was a sharp, electric white, forcing her to bite her lip to keep from screaming. He seemed to enjoy it, his smile widening as he watched the agony play across her features. Through the haze of pain and the roar of the music, Marissa's eyes found Mrs. Gable, the old housekeeper who had been more of a mother to her than Elizabeth ever was. Mrs. Gable was standing near a service entrance, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes filled with a desperate, quiet understanding. Marissa took a jagged breath and gave a microscopic nod. a signal they had practiced in the quiet hours of the morning. Marissa's hand in Julian's grip went limp, a calculated surrender that caused him to relax his own hold for a heartbeat. Mrs. Gable moved, intentionally colliding with a dessert trolley. The sound of crashing porcelain and the spray of champagne drew every eye in the room toward the far wall. A momentary lapse in the suffocating scrutiny. Thomas turned toward the noise, his hand dropping from Marissa's waist. Thomas Caldwell signaled for the band to continue, his voice a sharp command for order. In that sliver of time, the room became a vacuum of silence, the guests suspended in a state of confused expectation. Julian turned back to Marissa, the ring still poised at the tip of her finger, the light of the chandeliers casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The air felt thick, like water, every second stretching into an eternity. Marissa looked at the ring, then at Julian's face, and finally at the man she had called father. Marissa didn't wait for the ring to touch her skin. She wrenched her hand back with a violent, sudden strength that caught Julian off balance. Her fingernails raked across his palm, leaving 4 jagged red lines in their wake. In one fluid motion, she reached into the heavy silk of her skirts and tore the leather folder from its hidden tether. The sound of ripping fabric was lost in the sudden gasp of the crowd. She swung the folder with all her might, the leather hitting Julian across the face before she threw the contents into the air. A blizzard of white paper erupted between them. Bank statements, forged contracts, and audit reports fluttered through the air, hitting the polished floor and sliding across the shoes of the horrified guests. One of the folders hit Arthur Banks squarely in the chest, the document spilling out at his feet like a confession. Her voice rose, clear and cold, cutting through the stunned silence of the ballroom. She didn't scream. She spoke with the precision of a surgeon. She named the shell companies, the offshore accounts, and the exact dollar amounts Julian had siphoned from the Caldwell accounts to cover his own debts. She pointed at the papers on the floor, her finger steady. The guests leaned in, their faces masks of morbid curiosity, as they recognized the official seals of the National Bank and the red ink of the auditor's warnings. The whisper of the scandal moved through the room like a wildfire, leaping from one diamond-clad guest to another. Julian stood frozen, his face the color of old parchment, his eyes darting around the room as the trap he had built for her snapped shut on him. Arthur Banks didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, ignoring the dignity of his position, and scooped up a handful of the papers. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the columns of figures with a terrifying, practiced speed. The room held its breath, the only sound the rhythmic rustle of the evidence in his hands. He found the forged signature on the primary loan agreement and looked up, his face hardening into a mask of professional fury. He stood and looked directly at Thomas Caldwell. "It's all true," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Every word. This man is a fraud." The crowd erupted. The polite veneer of the Philadelphia elite shattered into a chaotic roar of accusations and shattering glass as Julian tried to back away from the light. Thomas didn't go for the papers. He went for Julian. His face was a dark, bruised purple, the rage of a man who realized he had been played like a fool. He lunged across the space, his hands closing around Julian's silk lapels. He shook the younger man with a feral strength, the two of them crashing into the long buffet table. A 5-tier wedding cake tilted and then collapsed in a slow-motion avalanche of white frosting and silver pearls. The crystal pyramid of champagne flutes followed, 1,000 glass shards raining down on the floor as the two men rolled in the wreckage. Marissa watched the man she had feared her entire life descend into a mindless, animalistic brawling, the dignity of the Caldwell name dissolving in a pool of spilled wine and cream. James saw her moving toward the exit and made his move. He lunged through the crowd, his face twisted in a snarl, his fingers reaching for her throat. Marissa didn't panic. She grabbed a heavy silver serving tray from a nearby stand, the metal cold and solid in her hands. As James closed the distance, she swung it in a wide, flat arc. The silver caught him squarely under the jaw with a sickening, metallic crack. He spun backward, his head hitting a marble pillar before he slumped to the floor, unconscious. Marissa dropped the tray and didn't look back. She hiked up her heavy skirts and sprinted for the service door behind the tapestry, her breath coming in sharp, exhilarated gasps. The cool, damp air of the service corridor hit her like a blessing, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the ballroom. She burst through the heavy oak front doors and onto the portico. The Philadelphia night had turned into a torrential downpour, the rain hitting the stone steps with a rhythmic, percussive force. The ivory satin of her dress was ruined in seconds, the fabric turning heavy and gray as it soaked up the water. At the bottom of the drive, a single black carriage waited, the horses stamping their hooves in the mud. Mrs. Gable leaned out the window, her face a pale moon in the darkness. Marissa scrambled down the steps, her white shoes caked in filth, and hauled herself into the carriage. She slammed the door just as a group of security guards rounded the corner of the house. The driver didn't need a command. He cracked the whip, and the horses surged forward, their iron shoes throwing sparks and mud into the night air as the Caldwell estate vanished into the gloom. The 30th Street station was a cathedral of steam and iron. Marissa stood on the platform, the heavy mist of the locomotive's exhaust swirling around her ruined gown. She clutched her small trunk of paints, the only thing she had managed to save. Suddenly, a hand clamped onto the handle of the trunk. She turned to find Thomas, his tuxedo torn, his face a map of bruises and desperation. He wasn't the titan of industry anymore. He was a drowning man trying to pull her back into the abyss with him. He pulled at the trunk, his eyes wild. Marissa looked at him, seeing the years of silence, the shredded paintings, and the cold calculations. She didn't scream. She stepped forward and shoved him in the chest with every ounce of her remaining strength. He lost his footing on the slick, wet timber of the platform and fell back into a pile of abandoned luggage. Marissa turned and stepped into the open door of the Pullman car, leaving his shouts to be swallowed by the whistle of the train. The metal groaned, and the floor beneath her feet began to vibrate. The train lurched forward, a slow, rhythmic chugging that signaled the breaking of the final tether. Marissa pressed her forehead against the cool, vibration-heavy glass of the window. She watched the figure of her father shrink into a tiny, dark speck on the platform, his arms still waving in a futile, empty gesture of command. The rain continued to fall, streaking the glass and blurring the outlines of the city she had called home. The station, the house, and the name Caldwell faded into a gray, indistinct fog. Inside the car, it smelled of coal smoke and old wool. But to Marissa, it was the scent of oxygen. She felt the weight in her chest, the pressure that had been there since she was a child, finally begin to dissolve, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful emptiness. 3 months later, the light in Chicago was different. Sharper, cleaner, reflecting off the vast expanse of Lake Michigan. Marissa stood in the center of a white-walled gallery in the Loop, the smell of fresh varnish and expensive espresso filling the air. She was wearing a simple, structured black dress that allowed her to move without the rustle of 1,000 unnecessary layers. She stepped back from her centerpiece, a large, aggressive canvas titled "The Ruins of Philadelphia." It was a storm of azure and deep ochre, a jagged, beautiful depiction of a crystal chandelier shattered in a sea of dark ink. She adjusted the heavy gilt frame, her fingers steady. She was no longer Marissa Caldwell. She was Claire Everly, a name she had found in a book of poetry on the train ride west. A group of critics, their faces etched with the practiced boredom of the art world, gathered around her. They didn't see a runaway bride or a failed investment. They saw a revelation. They spoke in hushed, earnest tones about her visceral use of negative space and the unflinching honesty of her palette. One man, a senior reviewer for the Tribune, stood before the ruins. For a long time, his eyes tracing the jagged lines of the shattered glass. He turned to her and offered a shallow, respectful bow. "You've captured the death of an era, Miss Everly," he said. Marissa offered him a polite, practiced smile, the flashes of the photographers no longer feeling like a firing squad, but like the birth of a new star. She took a sip of water, the cold clarity of it a reminder that she was finally, undeniably, free. The following morning, she sat at a small, wrought-iron table in a cafe near the gallery. The sun was warm on her neck, a gentle weight. She opened the morning edition of the Philadelphia Inquirer, her fingers staining slightly with the fresh ink. At the bottom of the business section, she found the headline she had been expecting. The Caldwell textile empire was gone, the assets seized to pay a fraction of the debts incurred by Julian Harris. Julian had been sentenced to 15 years at Eastern State Penitentiary for wire fraud and embezzlement. Thomas was under house arrest in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood, and James had disappeared to avoid a dozen outstanding warrants. Marissa slowly folded the paper. She felt no spike of joy, no rush of heat, only a quiet, profound sense of closure. The monsters were back in their cages. She walked out onto the balcony of her new studio, 20 stories above the hum of the city. The wind off the lake was cold and brisk, whipping her hair across her face. She took a deep, unrestricted breath, her lungs filling with air that didn't taste of linseed oil or lies. She looked down at her hands. The bruises were gone, replaced by the permanent, proud stains of cobalt and burnt sienna. She wasn't a daughter, a sister, or a wife. She was a painter. She turned back to the blank canvas waiting on the easel in the center of the room, picked up a palette knife, and began to work.